Hi, this is the After Freedom Law and Criminal Justice content session. Over the course of this session, we're going to be covering just basic principles of law and criminal justice and how these specifically apply to debating scenarios and the things that you'll need to prove in order to win these types of debates. Different questions you need to answer, different concepts you need to be aware of. Obviously, this is all can be applied in various scenarios depending on the context of your debate. They can be modified slightly, but this is the core structure you should generally be applying for these types of debates. Over the course of the session, we're going to be answering a few key questions in order to help you navigate these types of debates. Starting off with what exactly even is a criminal offense, then moving on to when should a practice be criminalized, what are the impacts of this criminalization, what are the aims of the justice system, how do you debate these specific aims, what is transitional justice, and how to approach transitional justice specifically in debates. Let's start off by looking at what exactly is a criminal offense. Crime is an interesting concept in the sense that it's very much defined on the way society perceives different actions at various points in time. And this perception of these actions evolves in line with societal morals and as we're growing and learning as a society. For example, things like homosexual intercourse used to be criminalized in the past, but right now it's widely accepted in a majority of nations. With weed, similarly, that also used to be illegal in the past, and now there's a larger movement going towards the legalization of weed. And this applies to other concepts, like, for example, rape and marriages, which is now considered illegal, child marriages, even divorces. Um, and you can see by this that law and criminal practices typically follow these societal norms, and these may result in good or bad implications for society. But that's what you've got to prove in these debates. What exactly are these implications and what are the impacts that they're having on society? But we'll get into this more a bit later on. In these types of like criminalization debates, you generally have to answer two core questions. Firstly, this idea of is it principally justified to criminalize a specific practice? Do we think that enough harm has come from this practice in order for us to criminalize it? And secondly, this idea of is this criminalization going to have a positive or negative effect on society and the people that have been affected by it? Types of examples for these types of debates include, as mentioned previously, this House supports the criminalization of marijuana. It can also extend to things like this House would criminalize or decriminalize graffiti. This House would criminalize adultery. Now, when should a practice be criminalized? And in this section, we're going to be covering some core concepts around what exactly does criminalization imply, and when should we be criminalizing things? What are the questions we need to answer in order to decide whether or not to criminalize something? And what are the general concepts we need to consider? So it's very important to recognize that when criminalizing something, it implies that we're actively limiting a person's individual freedom. And so that means we're restricting them from doing something that they would ordinarily be able to do. And in some cases, it's quite easy to argue why you would limit someone's liberties. For example, limiting someone's like individual freedom because they want to go and commit murder is a much easier thing to argue for than trying to argue about why you want to limit their individual freedoms because they're using drugs. What are the impacts of their drug usage that's resulting in us thinking that an action of criminalization needs to be placed in order for them to be punished, in order for us to stop this drug usage? And how do we then step in as the state or as a governing entity in order to make these decisions? And what are the metrics that we make these decisions on? So now these types of like criminalizations can be in multiple forms, right? When something's criminalized, there are various punishments that are attached to it. This can be in the form of prison time, creating some form of stigma with regards to a person or an action. So going back to the drug example, criminalizing the use of drugs makes or associates a negative connotation with that idea, which means that people who are doing drugs are going to be viewed in a bad light. And is that something we want as a society? Additionally, it means that we could also just be limiting someone's day-to-day activities. And is that a trade-off we're willing to make in order to criminalize a specific practice? So that means that this criminalization needs to be justified on a principle level, specifically with respect to the limitation of an individual's freedom. We need to be able to specifically show why we're willing to limit individuals' freedoms in specific scenarios. And then, like any debate, this is going to be quite a lot of give and take and way upping that's involved. We need to be able to show the pros and the cons that exist, and depending on your side, show why the side that you're arguing for far outweighs the other side and results in just a much more larger net benefit to society. There are also some debates that specifically focus on the individual and whether or not the individual should be liable for their actions. And in these debates, it's very important that you pay special attention to the content in the motion or the words in the motion to ensure that you're actually arguing the motion on the right concept. For example, motions like this House would hold um, holding directors criminally responsible for environmental damages caused by their companies. That's a specifically individual debate that's looking at specifically the directors of the company. You won't win the debate if you start arguing about whether or not we should hold like everyday citizens criminally liable for environmental damage, but you have to specifically analyze the director's role in this debate and what they're doing. So that means from prop side, you need to talk about, are directors actually responsible for all of the choices that are made? Do we think that they've had enough responsibility in this to be held criminally liable for this? And a secondary question that you need to answer is whether or not they've directly caused any form of harm, and did the harm come from them for them to be held criminally liable? And one could argue that directors are making these really large choices, and so does that then make them more criminally liable for something than anyone else in the company? Or is it because they haven't actively partaked in the environmental damage that we can lessen some of the blame? Or is it because they're speaking from a position of power for an entity that's considering a lot of people's mindsets before making these decisions, that we should let them out? So, with that in mind, there are kind of three core questions to answer for these types of debates that are focused specifically on individuals. One, did they directly cause the harm? Secondly, are these individuals criminally liable because they could have prevented the harm? So, could the director in this debate have stepped in and stopped a certain activity from happening? Were they equipped with all of the resources to do that? And lastly, did they actively make these harmful choices? Okay, now let's move away from the individual criminal liability debate into this idea of criminalizing specific practices. And this is where a large portion of debate sits. This idea of criminalizing or decriminalizing a specific concept, for example, gambling, or talking about trophy hunting, whether or not those activities should be criminalized. And in these types of debates, there are three main ways to show why you would support the criminalization of a specific practice. The first of which being the harm principle. So we can show that we can limit individual freedom when harm is caused to others. But in these scenarios, we need to prove why this harm is significant enough to merit that criminalization. So, for example, on with regards to gambling, we need to be able to show why the impact of that gambling is causing significant harm on everybody else to an extent that we need to criminalize this activity. Or even for trophy hunting, we need to look at why specifically the pain on animals is something that we think directly conflicts with this idea of the harm principle and is something that should be criminalized. So just saying that something is going to cause harm isn't enough. You have to ask the questions about why it's specifically relevant in the context of this debate. Why does it apply? Why is it something we care about? Why is it something we think that we need to stop happening in society? The second thing you can look at is this idea of big governments. So governments can intervene in cases to prevent people from harming each other, because that's essentially what we vote a government into power for. It's for this idea that they're in charge of protecting people, ensuring good service delivery, ensuring societal harmony exists. And this extends to certain decisions where we think that the harms caused by an individual are so large, the harms that they're causing to themselves specifically are so large that we need government to step in to prevent this from happening. So, for example, with gambling and the toll that can come from addiction, the self harm that can come from that, from just the pure negatives that come from addiction, could possibly be grounds for government to intervene and to stop a certain practice from occurring. And the reason why government is specifically motivated to do this is because one, they just value a productive society. That's what they've been put into power for. They want to have healthy individuals who are part of their country, who are living happy lives because that's their job. But also, secondly, in a more self-indulgent kind of way, governments care about generating a workforce that is going to be productive, that's going to get the job done. So they want more productive, hardworking, contributing members of society. They want to protect the mental health of their people. They want to protect the physical health of their people so that they can contribute to society and the growth of that particular society. Um, and the last way that you can argue in support of criminalizing a practice is by looking at moral justification. And this is quite simple. It's proving that a certain practice is immoral given a particular set of societal values. And whilst at its core, it's a simple idea, proving it is not easy. Morality is subjective. You need to prove that this particular moral practice is valued in society right now. It's something we as a society actively care about, and going against this is going to create immense harm in society. So, following from the previous discussion, now let's move on to the converse of this idea. What are the ways that you can oppose the criminalization of a specific practice? And so, again, there are three main ideas that exist here, and we've already touched on some of these in the previous slide. The first one being contesting the harm. So, on the opposing side, or the side that's arguing against a particular activity being criminalized, they can argue against the existence of the harm or arguing against a harm not being large enough or significant enough to criminalize it. So this means that possibly they could argue that animals don't feel pain the same way that we do. So maybe that isn't enough ground to criminalize an activity to the extent that the other team wants you to do it. Or maybe they think that there's a different way in order for us to mitigate the harm other than criminalization. Um, the second thing that they can do is argue small government. So, under small government, we assume that individuals that exist in a society are rational and informed and are making these choices to ensure that they are not conducting any activities that result in harm to others. And under small government specifically, we value individual freedom a lot more than the choices or decisions made by the government, which means that in these scenarios, we value individual choices. We value giving people the liberty to make these types of choices, which means that people can take drugs if they want to take drugs because we think that they're rational and informed enough when making these choices that they're not going to cause an inherent harm to other people. And note the importance of proving rationality and informed choices here. When making choices, it's really important that we set up our actors such that we can prove that they are rational actors and we can prove that the choices that they are making are informed. We can't just assume that these concepts hold true. We have to prove that these are true in the context of the debate before using it and moving forward. The third thing that you can do in this debate is you can contest the moral justification. And I've already touched on this. And it's the idea that morality in and of itself is subjective, let alone different time periods, different states, different groups of individuals already don't have the same moral ideas that exist. There are core moral ideas that are universal. For example, again, the idea of murder, but there are other things that people aren't necessarily on the same page on with regards to morality. And that's purely because different people have different like moral compasses and different ways that they characterize morality for themselves. So, in this case, in order to oppose the criminalization of a practice, you could argue against the moral justification directly, or prove that morality is subjective and show why the decision should be left to the individual's discretion. And we trust them to make the better decision because they have a better handle on the moral compass or the morality decisions that are being made in their society. Now, let's assume that you're able to justify criminalization principally. You're able to show that we think that criminalizing or not criminalizing a particular activity is justifiable on a principle level. You then need to be able to assess the practical outcomes of this particular activity as well, of criminalizing or non criminalizing a specific activity. And this is very important in debates. In these specific debates, it's really important to consider all concepts on a principle and a practical level, looking at it on both folds. Proving one won't necessarily guarantee you winning the debate. because you need to consider both of these ideas in conjunction. Now, how do we do this? To do this, we generally answer two main questions. One, how will criminalization shape behavior? And secondly, will this criminalization have an unintended harmful consequence? And those are two very important questions that we're going to be delving in a lot more moving forward with this idea of what are the aims of the justice system? What are we getting when we criminalize an activity? What is the justice system actually trying to do? At a high level, we can look at it with regards to criminalizing drug usage. So, for example, we could say it will shape the behavior of society by reducing drug usage and deterring younger people from using it because now they're afraid that they're going to go to prison, that something's going to happen, there's going to be negative connotations associated with using these things. Alternatively, the unintended harmful consequences that can come from this is that it could increase unsafe drug usage because now people aren't aware on how to conduct themselves appropriately using sterile environments, how to take it in a safe manner, and we could result in more overdoses or more injuries or illnesses coming because of these unsafe drug practices. Secondly, it could expand the black market. In general, when something is illegal or criminalized, it opens up avenues for illegal sales to happen, for the black market to thrive. And it could also just create more attraction to drugs because sometimes people are attracted to things that they aren't necessarily allowed to get. They seek some form of adrenaline rush from the illegality of a specific activity and they enjoy it, which makes them more attractive to something because it's illegal. So, as you can see, you can argue these things on both sides. And as positive as any choice can seem, for example, banning drugs seems like quite a positive choice that exists. We can also see the negative connotations that come with it as well. And in these specific argumentations, because there's always going to be good and bad on anything, we wouldn't be having a debate if there was inherently a fully positive experience that was going to come out of this or a fully negative experience that was going to come out of this. There's always going to be arguments on both sides. And that's why way ups become very important in these debates. Debating is based in the core idea of being able to do way ups and showing why you allow for a larger societal benefit on your side compared to the other side. We don't debate in absolutes. We debate in comparatives and showing why a specific side does more for the vulnerable individuals of society. Now let's look at the aims of the justice system. And this is a very, very core principle to remember when arguing these types of debates. You should be able to remember these four aims of the justice system at the top of your head. And every time you get this type of debate, you should be thinking about it and thinking about how it applies to the debate that you're in. So remember that the state has a responsibility in order to prosecute crime and hold justice and maintain social order. It's their job to hold criminals liable. It's their job to maintain social order and ensure that we aren't divulging into anarchy, that there are practices that exist to just regulate the way we exist as a society and the way that we behave. And often in debate, you need to be able to evaluate the state's response to a specific crime. And we do this by showing which side meets the aims of the justice system best. So in any debate, you should be able to look at the four aims of the justice system and evaluate how it applies to that debate and which of these the state is going to be able to uphold on a specific side, which ones we value more. It's also important to note that these all won't always exist. There are times when you're going to have to make trade-offs against specific ones in order to prioritize other aims of the justice system. And this is valuable because you need to be able to prove why the ones you value the most are the ones that you actually do value the most, and why by prioritizing those aims on your side of the house, you win the debate and you allow, again, for societal order to be maintained. So, the first aim of the justice system is rehabilitation, and this focuses on reforming a criminal so that they don't reoffend and that they can be integrated back into society and become productive members of society. And these things look at things like counseling, medication, even just upskilling people so that people who are conducting themselves in criminal activities purely out of necessity don't have to do that anymore. They have access to a job, they have skills to get a job when they leave prison. The second one is protection. A fundamental aim of the justice system is to ensure that they are protecting people, and that's their first and foremost aim. Ensuring that people are being protected. And this means that they need to be able to reduce the risk that is caused to society. And they do this by putting people in prison, putting them on probation and keeping an eye on them, putting them in programs in order to ensure that they are being taken away from society and society is being protected first and foremost. The third aim of the justice system is deterrence. And this is the idea that when we punish someone for a specific activity, we are then preventing these crimes from happening again in the future because people are now afraid of the consequences that come when they commit these crimes. And it's really important to acknowledge that this may not always be true. Some people aren't always deterred by certain activities. Some people have no choice but to make these choices. But having these deterrents in place can create some form of prevention mechanism for these crimes from happening again. And the last aim of the justice system is punishment or retribution. This idea of being able to deliver justice and preserve order in society. Victims need to feel like they've been listened to and the people that have harmed them are being punished in a way that they deem appropriate. They need to feel that way. Otherwise, we're just going to result in repeat offenses, revenge crimes, and even vigilante justice, where members of the society are in uproar because they don't feel a specific individual has been dealt with correctly and they think that they need to take matters into their own hands in order to punish these individuals. And you can look at when, like I said earlier, when looking at the aims of the justice system, it's not always possible to have everything at the same time. And we have to be able to make trade-offs. If we look at the death penalty, for example, in a debate about legalizing the death penalty and that being one of the ways for the state to uphold justice and maintain order because it's a punishment choice that they have, it will create quite an effective deterrent because people are going to be scared of losing their lives. They don't want the death penalty, they don't want to die. So they're going to be more afraid of the consequences that come from committing a specific crime. But at the same time, it directly goes against the idea of rehabilitation because if someone has been put through the death penalty, they're unable to be rehabilitated and be put out back into society. And in these situations, a lot of analysis needs to be done to show which aims of the justice system your side is choosing to value and why you're valuing them. You need to be able to show the benefits that come to the society by valuing the aims that you've chosen to value. Now, given the importance of the aims of the justice system in debates, we're going to spend some time to specifically look at how to use them in debates, how to evaluate them, how they become relevant in debates, and how you can win debates by arguing them in the correct way. So, like I mentioned, in general, these aims intersect. You can't always have all of the aims being met, just like with the death penalty example, where rehabilitation and deterrence cannot coexist. And this applies to a multitude of scenarios. For example, youth rehabilitation programs emphasize the idea of rehabilitation. They emphasize the idea of lower sentences for young individuals so that they can be put into these rehabilitation centers. They can be taught ways to improve their life. They can be treated if there are any underlying conditions, and then we can put them back out into society so that they can become productive members of society for the rest of their lives. But because rehabilitation is so heavily prioritized in these types of places, that means that punishment isn't as much doesn't have as much of an impact here. It means that they aren't always getting the harshest punishment for the crimes that they've committed. And maybe victims aren't always getting the type of retribution that they require. So in these types of debates, you need to do a few things. The first thing is you need to establish that the policy that you're implementing achieves the certain aims. So you can't just assume that because we've implemented the death penalty, it's going to act as a deterrent. You have to actively prove why it's going to be a deterrent. So showing why people are afraid of it. What are just the fundamental human behavioral habits that make them afraid of death? Why would they be afraid of actually being on the death penalty? Alternatively, talking about like prison and what it means, the harms that come from being into prison, why a lot of people don't enjoy being in prison, being separated from your family, all of those other aspects that come with being punished, and why we think that's going to cause an active deterrent, and why we think it's going to work in this debate and achieve the aims that we wanted to achieve. The second thing you need to do is you need to show that the aims you are prioritizing has more impact or value than others. Why does the state have a greater interest in one than the other? If we look back at the youth rehabilitation programs, because they are younger individuals of society, the state may have a larger emphasis on rehabilitating them and reintegrating them back into society because they have a lot more time to contribute and become productive citizens of society and possibly contribute in positive ways to society. The alternative is, though, maybe the state should actually be punishing them and ensuring that their aim or their core aim is to give retribution to the people that have been harmed, to the victims that have been harmed by these criminals. And in these debates, again, it becomes very important to show why a specific aim is more valued on your side than the other. And different sides are going to value different aims. So a core clash in this debate becomes about which are the aims of the justice system that we value the most. And when arguing this doesn't mean you can disregard what the other team is saying is the aims that they'll prioritize. You need to show why that has a lesser impact in your side of the house, why you think in this debate that particular aim isn't going to be as effective as the opposition team would like everyone to believe. So don't disregard what they're saying. Don't ignore them because you've decided that rehabilitation is the one you're going to focus on. Engage with all four aims of the justice system, but show why the ones you're prioritizing ensure the highest value and positive impact on society. So, another thing to be wary of when debating in these types of debates is the underlying assumptions that are part of the aims of the justice system. So, all of these aims exist, but they're all centered around these underlying assumptions that exist. So, let's look at rehabilitation. Rehabilitation assumes that people actually have the ability to reform, and debates need to focus on the most likely outcomes, right? So, we can't be absolute. It isn't possible that rehabilitation is going to be possible 100% of the time. There's going to be cases where it isn't going to be as effective as we would like it to be, and there are going to be days when it's just not going to work. Because sometimes people just we just can't rehabilitate certain people because they've been harmed or they've harmed to the extent that there's no way for us to let them see reason, right? So debates need to focus on this idea that not everything is absolute, but rather we need to focus on the most likely outcome that's going to happen. And that's where rehabilitation sits. It sits in the idea that we're assuming that most people generally have the ability to reform if we spend enough time with them, if we give them access to the right resources. And we need to show in this scenario specifically why a certain type of offender will reform. So there are some places, for example, like pedophiles, for example, where it's quite unlikely that they're going to reform because generally, like science and just history have shown us that these are general reoffenders. Whereas people who have committed crimes because they suffer from a mental illness, or people who have committed crimes because they come from poverty and they've had no choice, are more likely going to be able to be rehabilitated. So being able to hone in on the specific type of offender that is being argued in this debate is very valuable in arguing rehabilitation. The second idea is this idea of punishment. And so people engage with punishment in different emotional capacities and may want harsher or more lenient things. In some cases, a victim may have forgiven someone and may want them to have a lesser punishment because they've forgiven them. In other cases, an individual may be having a lot more difficulty processing the emotions that come from whatever criminal activity was conducted by by this person, and they may want a more harsher sentence. So then the debate becomes what the obligation is in this debate. Do we have an obligation to the victim or do we have an obligation to the sentencing? Should there be uniform sentencing practices that we apply regardless of what happens? Should we just uniformly sentence people without taking into consideration a lot of the victim's emotions? Or do we think that having the victim's emotions accounted for in a trial allows for a more fairer sentencing? And these are important trade offs to have when engaging with this idea of punishment and how the victim's emotions come into play. The last one is deterrent. And again, here we assume that offenders are rational and they're able to weigh up the impacts of offending. But at the same time, a lot of people are irrational and uninformed when making decisions. Maybe they don't even know the punishments that are associated with the crimes that they're trying to commit. So are we actually creating an effective deterrence if people are not educated, if people don't understand the impacts of their actions and they're not going to learn? And are we going to stop reoffending from happening in these cases? The last concept we're going to look at in this session is this idea of transitional justice. Now, transitional justice considers challenges faced by post conflict states. It looks at the transitions that they're going through from the time of oppression, so transitioning from a dictatorship that was specifically violent and oppressive towards moving towards freedom and democracy. And what happens here? Because in these cases, there have been a lot of people who have been harmed, who have been discriminated against, who have been oppressed, and they're looking for some kind of justice. The state needs to provide some form of justice. They need to be able to show these people that we can move to a point where freedom and democracy can exist and that they're going to be respected and that the past harms aren't necessarily going to come back again because we've dealt with all of the things that have happened in the past and we've resolved those conflicts. So, examples of this include, for example, Egypt and Libya, who have moved, or even South Africa, who went through the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, post apartheid, in order to heal from the things that have happened to us as a nation. So, the thing here to consider mainly is should members of these oppressive regimes be prosecuted or should we forgive them in an attempt to heal from the past? And that's where a lot of these debates lie. The things about these debates is that they generally require you to know a lot that's going on in the world, right? So debating in general requires you to be informed about different conflicts that exist between states, different um, possible oppressive regimes and the transitions that are happening out of them, and just being aware of the different things that are happening in the world. And whilst this is valuable in a debating capacity, it's also just valuable in a day to day capacity, being aware of the things that are going on around you, the lives that are being impacted because of what's going on. And it's really important to continue to keep a handle on that and not live in a silo outside of those experiences that other individuals are going through. And even though these debates require that type of large knowledge base, there is still a predefined kind of structure that you can use in debating in order to tackle these types of debates. So, how should you approach transitional justice debates? And there are three main ways that these can be approached. Firstly, with this idea of a retributive approach. Secondly, restorative approaches. Or thirdly, forgetting. So let's start with this idea of retributive approaches. So in these cases, you prosecute individuals and impose sentences that reflect the crimes that they've conducted. And this provides justice for victims and creates a deterrence. However, at the same time, it could also result in increased conflict and it also, in some cases, these situations don't allow for victims to participate. So, whilst the victims are getting justice because their oppressors are being punished, and we are creating a deterrent because we've actively punished people, we could create an uproar because maybe someone would deem a particular sentencing too lenient or they would deem it too harsh, and that could create increased conflict in an already fragile state that is still recovering from a lot of the harms that have existed there. But secondly, because victims aren't always allowed to participate, we don't always know the full story. We have some ideas of the accounts that happened, but victims aren't able to relay what happened to them in a way that allows us to have a full understanding of the circumstances that exist, and they aren't always going to be heard in the capacity that we would like them to be heard. Now, the second thing is this idea of restorative justice or restorative approaches to dealing with transitional justice. And in this case, we attempt to restore order since before the crime. We're trying to get us to a point of social order where we were able to coexist pre the point of all of these oppressive regimes happening. This particular method emphasizes healing and forgiving over prosecution. It emphasizes having conversations, engaging in conversations, understanding where people are coming from, why a particular activity harmed them so much, so that we can heal and learn and forgive and grow as a nation moving forward, so that we can get to a point of social cohesion. In these scenarios, victims can also participate, so it's more likely that we'll have a better understanding of the truth. But moreover, victims' voices are being heard. They're able to voice it, and this has a particularly healing effect on people because they're able to go through the process of explaining what they've been through, the harms that they faced, and they're able to discourse and have conversations about it. Fundamental principles of like psychology and therapy lie in this idea of being able to communicate and have conversations with people who are causing harm to you. However, with this in mind, perpetrators don't always face significant punishments in these cases. Sometimes they're granted amnesty in exchange for the truth, because if they're able to come forth and tell us really what happened, why they did a certain thing, how they did a certain thing, we then sometimes in these situations reward them in exchange for that information. We don't want to, if people go into these discussions with the understanding that they're going to be prosecuted at the end, they're less likely going to give up information. But when we can incentivize them with an idea of like amnesty, they're more likely to engage in the conversation and exchange more information so that we can get a better understanding of the truth. But this means that we then prevent justice for victims sometimes. Sometimes people want the justice to be served. They want to see their perpetrators being actively punished. And that doesn't always happen in the situation. For example, the TRC in South Africa, where there was a lot more like peaceful discourse that happened to identify what exactly happened and why it happened. The last way to approach these types of debates is just forgetting. So this is when people just move on without confronting what occurred, and just move on to this next phase of life. Now, this is positive in the sense that it could prevent additional violence from occurring, preventing further instability that accompanies just confronting conflict. Because when two people with opposing views are forced to confront this and engage, it isn't always going to be smoothly, especially when looking at the types of regimes that these things are coming from, where there's been active and large scale harms that have been caused. It isn't always possible for these conversations to happen without it digressing into violence and further instability. So we prevent that by just moving on and not confronting the problems. However, this also means that one, we aren't allowing victims to have a conversation, we aren't allowing for this healing process to happen, but it also means that we may not be doing enough in order to prevent repeat offenses from happening. It means that because no punishment was delivered, because we haven't confronted these people, confronted these crimes, it's also possible we could just slip back into this oppressive regime again, because people don't have any fear about doing it. They don't understand the repercussions. There haven't been any direct repercussions because of this. So these are the three different approaches that you can take when dealing with transitional justice, and they become very important in these types of international relations, post conflict types of debates that we argue quite a bit, because it's really important that we put ourselves in these real world situations. We've reached the end of the law and criminal justice session. There are a few things that have come out of this, and I really hope that it's been helpful and beneficial to you and has helped you understand the ideas that come with law and criminal justice debates most of the time. Um, to summarize, there are a few things I'd like to flag. Like one, just always remember in these types of debates to be sensitive and to acknowledge that there are real harms that exist. So when talking about addiction, when talking about post-conflict states, when talking about um, the death penalty, these are very sensitive topics that directly impact individuals' lives. So you have to approach these debates stylistically with that ideas in mind and being sensitive about it and not being flippant about it because it doesn't directly impact your life in that very moment. Secondly, even though we've covered a lot of things in this debate, there are core things you can get out of this, and that is asking and answering the right questions. Asking, is this principally justified? Asking, is it like what are the harms and benefits that come from this implementation? Looking at the four ends of the justice system and evaluating it, looking at the different ways that we can deal with transitional justice and evaluating that as well. The second thing, the next thing that you need to take note of is structure. In these types of debates, because there's core structures in the way that we expect you to formulate your argument in order for it to be impactful, it's very important that as a speaker, you're structured and being very clear about how you're doing this. This means that when you're talking about rehabilitation as an aim of a justice system, you need to talk about it very clearly and then move on to deterrence and explicitly say that you're moving on to deterrence so we can follow your train of thought and evaluate this moving forward. And the last thing is, as you grow as a speaker, you're going to evolve to the point where you're going to take these fundamental concepts and evolve them to an extent where it's a lot more advanced. You can apply a lot more examples, you can apply a lot more analysis. But even when getting to that level, it's really important to remember that the basics should always be the pillar of your debate. It should always be the foundation. It all stems from these core ideas in order to ensure that you can win these types of debates. So I wish you all the best, and I hope this is helpful and that you're able to win your next criminal justice or law debate.